You're on TV, and this story will live on the web. You're talking about Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
How carefully must you choose your words right now?
I'd like to think that I've always been careful, but at this moment I'm especially careful, not because I want to get away with something, but because I want to be heard.
Imagine you're going on the air at CNN. There are cameras, there are bright lights, there are questions being thrown at you. What goes through your mind?
What's going through my mind is there are so few opportunities for Palestinians to be able to tell our own story. I have to get this right. It's like a hostile interrogation. As a Palestinian, I've so deeply internalized all the landmines that we can step on that it's almost second nature. And I also know what's at stake.
Some tough stuff has to be said, some critiques have to be made. But at the core, I believe that if I am careful with my words, I can help contribute to a conversation that will lead to an outcome that is freedom, justice, equality, and self-determination for everybody.
Hello, I'm Richard Gizbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post from Washington, D.C. We're still more than a year away from the American presidential elections, but there are already more than 20 candidates running on the Democratic side, vying for the right to take on Donald Trump in November 2020. As they establish their campaigns, stake out their policy positions, and fight for news coverage, among the issues threatening to divide their party is this country's relationship with Israel.
America's support for Israel, usually at the expense of Palestine, has been unwavering, one of the most reliably bipartisan issues in Congress, with Republicans and Democrats standing with their Israeli allies through thick and thin. But there is change in the air. You can see that online and, to a lesser extent, on the airwaves.
We have, I would say, probably the best relationships right now with Israel that we ever had. I think
President Trump's unquestioning support of Israel and its ever more hawkish prime minister has shifted the debate.
No more apologies! No.
In the Democratic Party, the firmly pro-Israel old guard faces a challenge from a rising wing of progressives and activists who are calling out Israel as never before.
In other words, the goal must be to try to bring people together and not just support one country, which is now run by a right-wing, dare I say, racist government.
They sense an opportunity to force previously taboo topics such as BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, into the political and media mainstream.
One of the most critical rights that we have in our country is freedom of speech. I cannot imagine our country not having the right to economic boycott.
The narrative on Israel is shifting, not just here in D.C., but in newsrooms, reflecting what is being said online, on university campuses, and amongst activists across the country.
That's what we're here to examine in D.C., New York City, and the states of Michigan and Texas.
The most recent changes in Washington began at the ballot box. Last year's midterm elections sent 111 new faces to the Capitol, resulting in the most racially and gender-diverse Congress in America's history.
For the first time, more than 100 female House members were sworn in today, including the first two Muslim women.
Michigan's Rashida Tlaib and Minnesota's Ilhan Omar. Challenging conventional Washington wisdom on immigration policy, racial injustice, and economic inequality is not what provoked the most intense criticism of these congresswomen. Their positions on Israel did.
The same wave that brought Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib into office, the same wave that makes Bernie Sanders so popular amongst young people, that same progressive wave is actually creating space for two congresswomen to support boycott, divestment, and sanctions for the first time ever, to criticize Israel very openly and to call out the U.S.'s policy on Israel more broadly.
The bipartisan nature of support for Israel that for several decades has been sort of the standard position for any ambitious politician to take, that has been blown wide open. And part of it is the Ilhan Omar conversation, part of it is the election of Ilhan and of Rashida Tlaib. We know that the progressive movement is decreasingly seeing Israel as an ally and increasingly are concerned about Palestinian rights.
At the same time, the critique and the punishment for critiquing Israel is becoming much harsher. We see that Israel's influence is waning, that the heterodoxy around Israel as infallible, as something that both sides of the aisle will protect, we see that crumbling. So it makes sense. It makes sense that as it's crumbling, there isn't a hegemony that holds up itself, where people just self-correct and self-discipline, but instead there is a rise in the coercive force to punish those who step out of line.
She's a supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. She suggested that if you are a supporter of Israel, you are guilty of dual loyalty in the past. I mean, she, along with Ilhan Omar, is part of an anti-Semitic contingent of the Democratic Party, now being protected by the Democratic leadership.
So I expected, obviously, some pushback. What I mean by pushback is, ugliness and hate and misunderstanding and anger being directed at me, and really my faith or somebody that looks like me kind of developed into this massive kind of targeting and attack.
Because
Rashida Tlaib has been pressured and scrutinized in a way first-term members of Congress almost never are. And she says what her colleague Ilhan Omar has faced has been worse.
It's a really critical time, and Ilhan Omar in so many ways is at the forefront of being a person that is there at the right time, at the right place. And we have to uplift that.
So when this...
Even before she became a congresswoman, Omar had been branded an anti-Semite for her criticism of Israel. Then, in February, after a Republican congressman repeated that accusation and an online debate ensued, Omar tweeted 6 words, echoing lyrics from the world of hip-hop, words for which she would later apologize. The Benjamins were a reference to $100 bills. Omar was talking about the millions the pro-Israel lobby spends in Washington. The online reaction was swift. Batya Ungar-Sargon, the opinion editor of a Jewish newspaper, The Forward, accused Omar of peddling a malevolent trope. Omar responded by calling out AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, the most influential pro-Israel lobby group in the U.S. Batya Ungar-Sargon's reply went viral.
This country is desperately in need of a conversation for how we can be leveraging our closeness with Israel to end the occupation of the Palestinians. That is not the conversation that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is having. She did not criticize Israel. What she did was characterize support for Israel among Americans and among American Jews in a way that was just off enough, just wrong enough that it slipped right into the well-worn grooves of anti-Semitic tropes. What do I mean by that? She criticized AIPAC, right, the Israel lobby. Of course, you can criticize AIPAC without being anti-Semitic. I do it all the time. The problem was that she mischaracterized AIPAC exactly in a way that fell into an anti-Semitic trope.
Just like everyone else, I read the tweets and I thought, I don't see this as being particularly anti-Semitic or even particularly controversial. There are progressive American Jews, people I know well, who hear some of the things that are being said and just it hits something deep inside of them. And I think it hits them sometimes as allies who say, I've been a good ally of the rights of the Palestinians or human rights, but here this hurts me so much, you've gone too far. And this sense of we should be able to pull you back and tell you what is the right way to criticize Israel so that you don't offend us. By the same token, it is not up to white or Jewish progressives to tell Palestinians or progressives of color what is the acceptable way to express their concerns. That's not a good look for progressives, to say the least.
The controversies around Ilhan Omar's position on Israel and Palestine and the language she uses did not end with the tweet affair. A few weeks later, at a town hall meeting that was live streamed, Omar said this.
I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country.
She was talking about Israel. The context was disregarded, and once again she was called anti-Semitic.
The charge of anti-Semitism is leveled at anybody who is potentially vulnerable to it. So, for example, when Thomas Friedman of the New York Times says that AIPAC bought and paid for an applause line, got Congress to basically applaud a Netanyahu speech, nobody refers to that as anti-Semitic because they know that that charge would not stick on somebody like Thomas Friedman. By contrast, when you have a Muslim black member of Congress making comments about the Israel lobby, she's much more vulnerable to that kind of charge.
She is a hater. I'm going to say it. She is filth. The whole world is watching. What's an Israeli audience supposed to take from a comment like that?
What she did not say critically, she did not say anything about American Jews using money to control politics, and she said absolutely nothing about American Jewish loyalties to the United States or to Israel or anything of that sort. And yet that was the dominant narrative in the media, which I thought was really preposterous.
The media pylon did not come out of nowhere. It was a long time in the making.
Congresswoman Ilhan Omar under attack for anti-Semitic tweets.
It developed in the corridors and backrooms of American politics, where legislators, the reporters tracking their words,
Anti-Semitic trope.
and studio anchors across the country have collectively constructed and reinforced a largely black and white narrative on a story with multiple shades of gray.
It is an anti-Semitic charge that has been used against the Jewish people literally for hundreds of years.
The condemnations from the political side came not just from Republicans,
Good afternoon.
but also from Democratic congressional leaders like Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. They reflexively prepared a resolution for a vote to condemn anti-Semitism. In effect, they were singling out Omar, preparing to bring her to heel. But the pushback was fierce and unprecedented.
The young, multi-ethnic, progressive wing of the party demanded that any resolution, any vote over what Ilhan Omar had said, had to condemn not only anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia, hate speech against immigrants, the LGBT community, and other marginalized Americans.
Then, when key Democratic contenders weighed in, siding with the new guard over the old, the Democratic leadership did the math and realized it did not have the votes. It had to concede to the pressure from the progressives.
The resolution is agreed.
And widen the scope of the resolution. That marked a turning point. Over the course of 70 years, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, has grown into one of the most influential foreign policy lobbying groups in Washington. Its annual conference is a key event on the Capitol's calendar, a mix of politics, pageantry, and hardcore partisanship. 18,000 people attended this year's gathering. Political consultants, activists, journalists, politicians from Israel and the U.S., including presidential candidates and congressional leaders.
Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth.
Politicians have much to gain by allying themselves with AIPAC. The group has a disproportionate amount of clout to shape legislation, promote pro-Israel politicians, and direct funding their way from allied donors. But one of AIPAC's greatest achievements lies in what is or is not said, its ability to effectively set the boundaries of the Israel-Palestine debate in the U.S. across the political and media spheres.
One thing that's really important to remember is that lobbying is part of the democratic process. It's a pretty terrible part. It has a big corrupting influence. AIPAC, and not just AIPAC, uses its power and influence to ensure the U.S. has pro-Israel positions, but the NRA uses its power and influence to keep there from being laws against guns. The oil and coal industry uses the power of its lobby to make sure that environmental regulations are not passed even though we're in a crisis of climate change.
In a capital knee-deep in lobby groups, AIPAC has plenty of company. In foreign policy lobbying alone, Arab Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar all play a high-stakes, big-money game to cultivate politicians, influence them, and shape media narratives, usually out of the range of news cameras. AIPAC used to be the industry standard in lobbying, but the others have been catching up, and there are unmistakable signs that things are changing.
This year, 7 Democratic presidential candidates stayed away from this conference. As recently as 4 years ago, in 2016, that would have been unthinkable. The long-standing taboo that you do not criticize AIPAC is now being challenged. DC's most powerful lobby is facing the kind of scrutiny it's never seen before.
Well, I think AIPAC's really losing a lot of power. Trump, in a way, he obviated them, right? He's a sort of one-man Israel lobby. So he made them a little bit obsolete on the right. And he sort of made them toxic on the left because anything associated with Israel is now going to have to account for its injustice. AIPAC at this point, I would say, is really it's losing a lot of power.
And other Jewish advocacy groups, J Street, Jewish Voice for Peace, If Not Now, have emerged in the U.S. Progressive voices now challenging AIPAC's dominance over discourse on Israel and Palestine. And news outlets have grown bolder when dealing with AIPAC. Journalists dig deeper into the group's work and question it more openly than they chose to or felt able to in the past.
As it becomes more and more clear that AIPAC does not speak for the American Jewish community, and that in fact it is at odds with the majority of the American Jewish community, I think we're going to see an increased willingness to investigate what AIPAC is really about.
Still, the limits on discourse over Palestine and Israel remain, and the consequences for venturing beyond them can be career-threatening. Last November, Mark Lamont Hill, an academic and activist, as well as a paid political contributor at CNN, learned that the hard way. Lamont Hill made a speech on Palestine at the UN. It lasted 21 minutes and consisted of 2,837 words. He ended it by calling for
a free Palestine from the river to the sea.
His critics online contended that those last 6 words, from the river to the sea, amounted to a call for the elimination of Israel. The counter-argument was that that was not what Lamont Hill meant, that the rest of his speech made that abundantly clear. However, within 24 hours, without so much as speaking to Lamont Hill, CNN fired him.
I can't say what red line I crossed in literal terms because I wasn't given any specific reason or analysis. Obviously, the speech was the red line. The protests, however, from the speech were largely around those last 6 words, from the river to the sea. That's what at least became the pretext for the outrage from many people.
Is there a double standard at play here? Because you get fired for saying what you said at CNN, yet the network continues to employ, for his punditry, a former American senator, Rick Santorum. He once denied that Palestinians even exist. So how much of this do you feel has to do with what gets said, and how much is about who says it?
I think it's both. If I had said, as Benjamin Netanyahu's son had said a few weeks ago on Twitter, Israel is a Jewish state from the river to the sea, I would have not been fired. I would have not been criticized. It would have gone unnoticed. Now, obviously, when people of color or when Muslims say it, there are even lower thresholds for critique in this vein.
CNN succumbed to a very serious smear campaign against Mark Lamont Hill that was driven by a wide range of pro-Israel forces in the United States. Seth Mandel, who was the editor of the Washington Examiner, he accused Mark Lamont Hill of supporting genocide against Jews, which is just utterly ridiculous. And then you have even people like Ben Shapiro, who is a popular personality on the right. He also joined the campaign to brand Mark Lamont Hill an anti-Semite. We're in an environment where people are susceptible to smear campaigns. There is no question about it. And unfortunately, large media companies are concerned about their image, and so they sometimes respond in the wrong way to smear campaigns.
Twice over the past decade, CNN has fired veteran journalists, Jim Clancy and Octavia Nasser, for online comments that offended pro-Israel voices. And unbeknownst to most of the network's viewers, its lead political anchor, Wolf Blitzer, wasn't always a journalist. He used to work for AIPAC, a one-time pro-Israel lobbyist, now occupying a CNN anchor chair. His former employer and other pro-Israel advocates don't just focus their efforts on politicians elected to Congress or news networks based in New York. They do plenty of lobbying work beyond Washington.
And it's paying off, particularly at the state level. More than half of the 50 states have now passed laws that shield Israel from a campaign of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement. In some cases, those laws don't just ban states from hiring employees who support BDS, they force American citizens to sign an oath of loyalty to another country, Israel.
Many of the anti-BDS laws are virtually identical, copy and paste pieces of legislation, written in clear violation of the U.S. Constitution and Americans' First Amendment right to free speech.
Many of my colleagues don't even know and realize that's what they sign on to. Do you know that? I've talked to them. They did not realize that this wasn't about, hey, we support Israel and Israel is our friend. This was also about suppressing people's freedom of speech by saying no one can economically boycott the state of Israel. And to me, you want to show support of Israel, then show support in other forms, not by oppressing the American public from speaking up. We're turning into a country that is not democratic, is not about freedom of expression, religion, speech, all of those things.
Although two organizations, CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, are fighting that trend in the courts and in some cases winning.
From KETR Public Radio.
The case of George Hale, for instance, a radio journalist whose station broadcasts out of Texas A&M University. Having once reported from the West Bank and having seen the effects of the occupation, Hale supports the BDS campaign. Last year, the university, which is funded by the state of Texas, required Hale to sign a contract stipulating that he would not participate in or speak in favor of a boycott of Israel.
I mentioned that I didn't agree with the clause. I made that very clear, and they rejected that immediately. He'll sign it or he won't work. Those are the exact words from the higher-ups.
This past April, a federal judge in Texas struck down the state's anti-BDS law on constitutional grounds, saying it threatens to, quote, manipulate the public debate through coercion rather than persuasion. The judge ruled that boycotts are constitutionally protected under the First Amendment guaranteeing freedom of expression, since, he said, such campaigns are inherently expressive.
How is it that you are going to condition somebody's employment on their political activity that poses no harm or national security threat, right? How is it that participating in a grassroots campaign to overcome diplomatic intransigence, to hold a primary U.S. ally accountable to human rights norms and international law, somehow a threat? So zooming out to see the context, it's what has been legislated across the United States in an effort to defeat top-down what has not been able to be crushed from the bottom up.
So now the effort is to tweak these laws to get around that by saying, well, it only applies to companies of maybe 10 or more people. They're trying to figure out how we can tweak until we have legislation that, fine, maybe it won't prevent George Hale from boycotting Israel, and he'll still be able to get his contract, but as a matter of U.S. law and U.S. policy, it will deem boycotts of Israel or settlements to be across a red line, illegitimate, and to some extent illegal.
250 million Americans live in states where laws like these have been passed. So I think it's important for people to understand that this is not like a issue that applies to only like a tiny little group of people. It's not impossible to imagine a scenario in which a state legislature could basically make your employment contingent upon you signing that you won't boycott the NRA or boycott Planned Parenthood or whatever else. So it's important that we take a step back and realize that this is not about Israel and this is not about Palestine or the Middle East, but it's actually about our rights as Americans, and that really, in many ways, free speech is under attack, across the United States.
A danger to free speech in what many Americans call the land of the free, over a conflict that lies more than 4,000 miles away. All those state laws written to narrow what little space there is for criticism of Israel may in fact be a tangible sign, evidence that for the first time, the pro-Israel lobby is losing ground in this argument. And Israel's critics may have found an unwitting ally in President Trump. He's deeply unpopular among American Democrats, and even moderate Republicans have grown uncomfortable with his seemingly unconditional support of the Netanyahu government and its policies. We repeatedly asked AIPAC officials for an interview for this program. They refused. Had they said yes, we would have asked them whether Donald Trump is helping or hurting Israel's cause. To some, the answer is obvious.
The United States has long been biased in favor of Israel for many decades. But what the Trump administration has done is escalated that to a whole new level, where the United States right now is an active participant in Israel's war against the Palestinian people in a way that we have never seen before. Despite these extremely troubling developments on the ground, We are beginning to see a shift in discourse within the United States on this issue, where people finally identify pursuit of these policies with the extreme regressive right that Donald Trump essentially represents at this point.
You could be tempted to say, oh my God, things are getting more intense, it's more draconian, the battle's almost lost. And I say quite the opposite. I'm saying because it's so tough right now, because the policies are so intense, there's an opportunity here. Dr. Martin Luther King said, only when it is darkest can you see the stars. The policy moment in some ways is very dark. But I see a star of possibility, and I think in the next 10 years we'll be having a very different conversation about Palestine and about Israel and about justice than we've ever had before.
The 2020 elections are still almost a year and a half away. American voters will have a multitude of issues to consider before they cast their ballots. And for the vast majority, their country's relationship with Israel will not be the deciding factor. But elections do have a way of clarifying things.
And the campaigning, the rallies, the news conferences, the TV interviews, the tweets, the terminology, all of them will reflect what Americans, be they politicians, academics, or journalists, are allowed to say. What is permissible discourse on Palestine and Israel?
Things are clearly changing. What we do not know and will not know until the votes are cast is how much. You've been watching a special edition of our program on Palestine, Israel, and American politics. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.